we don't all start at the same position. There are systemic forces to do with race and class which really hamper children and adults' journey. And unless we acknowledge those, we're not really ever going to tackle anything, because we'll just keep looking at the results. Everything is about evidence, and that evidence is always about pupils' outcomes. Well, they won't change if we don't start by looking at where does the injustice start.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to episode 17 of the Rethinking Education podcast. I'm particularly excited to bring you this episode because today's guest is one of the main reasons I started this podcast. But before I introduce her, a couple of brief notices, if I may. Firstly, you may have noticed some unusual activity on this podcast channel recently. The last thing to be published was not a podcast, but a recording of the first ever Rethinking Education campfire conversation. As you may be aware, if you've listened to previous episodes, a really quite lovely, life-affirming online community has grown up around this podcast, the Rethinking Education Mighty Network. Through this network, I've met lots of incredible people who have many important things to say and fascinating perspectives to share. Somebody described it recently as being like a bat signal for innovative educators, and I think that's true. In just a few short months, I've heard about so much innovative practice happening here in the UK as well as around the world, and I get the sense that there are lots more people out there who are quietly, creatively carving their own paths. More on this shortly. So, in an attempt to bring more people into the Rethinking Education conversation, including the voices of young people wherever possible, we've decided to set up these campfire conversations. As you may have noticed, the Rethinking Education podcast tends to feature quite long, in-depth, planned conversations, usually with individual guests. To contrast with this, campfire conversations are more spontaneous, live-streamed group conversations which will run alongside the podcast. When we first floated this idea on Twitter, we were deluged with responses from people who want to take part in these conversations and with recommendations for people whose voices you would like to see included. So we now have a long and ever-growing list of people queuing patiently to join us by the campfire, marshmallows in hand, and we'll be working our way through that list in the weeks and months ahead, bringing more and more people into the conversation as we think through the detail of how we might rethink and reform education in such a way as to bring about a more harmonious, less hair-raising state of world affairs. Campfire conversations are live-streamed every other Saturday at 12 noon UK time, and the next one is this coming Saturday, the 8th of May 2021. This week we'll be joined by two special guests, Kulvan Atwal, a friend of the podcast and former guest who's also name-checked in today's episode. And if you haven't listened to the episode with Kulvan yet, I urge you to do so at the next available opportunity. I'm also delighted that we'll be joined this week by Lottie Cook from Pupil Power, a community of young people working to rethink and reshape education from the ground up. Lottie recently wrote a brilliant short article for the Innovate journal outlining her vision for an education system fit for the 21st century, which I'll link to in the show notes. Some of Lottie's ideas, including the need for a more diverse, less Eurocentric curriculum, feature heavily in today's episode, by the way. Because campfire conversations are live streamed, we're able to have people commenting and feeding ideas, questions, and observations into the main conversation. We're also looking at using other platforms in future so that we can bring even more people into these conversations. If you would like to join us live this Saturday, you need to join the Rethinking Education Mighty Network. You can do so by visiting rethinking-education.mn.co or by downloading the Mighty Networks app and searching for Rethinking Education. Speaking of the bat signal, the next episode of the Rethinking Education podcast will feature a conversation with four incredible women, three of whom I've met through the Mighty Network or through the podcast, who've been rethinking education in really interesting ways in recent years, so keep your eye out for that one. And so to today's guest. Naheeda Maharasingam is the head teacher of Rathfern Primary School in London, the leader of the Rathfern Teacher Research Network, and a local leader of education, or an LLE. I first met Naheeda in 2018 through my work as a programs leader at the UCL Institute of Education, and I've been working with Rathfern Primary School in a range of ways ever since. Rathfern is an absolutely remarkable school for a range of reasons, but really for the way in which, as a community, they are laser focused on disrupting the trajectory of disadvantaged pupils. And as you'll soon discover when we get into this conversation, Naheeda is a remarkable leader. Everything she does is driven by this incredibly strong sense of moral purpose, as well as a burning sense of injustice at the social and economic inequality that we see all around us, the UK being one of the most unequal countries in the developed world. Whenever I spend time with Naheeda, I always come away with a sense that I would really have liked to speak to her for much longer, and I also think that people should hear what she has to say. And so the idea of the Rethinking Education podcast was born. If I recall correctly, I first gave voice to this idea in conversation with Naheeda about a year ago, which came as much as a surprise to me as it did to her. So, if you've been spending lots of time listening to these podcasts of late, which a growing number of people seem to be doing to my absolute surprise and delight, it's all Naheeda's fault. I hope you enjoy the show. Naheeda Maharasingam, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Hello, nice to be here. Surprised, but happy to be here.
Well, I'm not so surprised because, as you may be aware, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but you are one of the main reasons that I set up this podcast, because I was meeting lots of interesting people through my work. And I was just thinking, partly for selfish reasons, because it would be difficult for me to suggest, let's have a 3-hour chat sometime because you're really busy. So the podcast is in some ways a ruse that just allows me to have like in-depth conversations with really interesting people. But I just think that so much of the work that you do is, really impressive, and the journey that you've been on at Rathfern. And I'm really keen to share that with other people so that people can hear about what it is that goes on there. So I'm really looking forward to getting stuck in. Let's begin with Rathfern. We'll talk later about your sort of your life and what came before this this journey that you've been on with this school. But let's start here. So can you take us back to the beginning of your journey to Rathfern? This was your first headship, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. It is my first and only, it seems, headship at the moment anyway. So I've been here 13 to 14 years. So the school we're based in Catford in southeast London. We're a Lewisham school. I'm very proud of that, the Battle of Lewisham and all that. And I had worked, prior to being a head, I was a deputy head in Lewisham as well. And it was a real surprise to me that I got the headship, because my son was going off to secondary school and I thought, well, what shall I do? I could stay because I was still loving what I was doing. Decided to just apply for a headship because I just completed the MPQH, which I hadn't enjoyed, actually. I didn't really feel I learnt very much from it. So I just thought, throw caution to the wind, have a go, and bizarrely got the job. The school, and I understood why when I got here. The school had been in special measures and had just got out, though the local authority didn't believe it should have got out of special measures. There was a bit of game playing going on for it to get out. So there was a huge need for change and deep love, I would say, in the school, especially for the children and the community. So they were huge. It was a huge task ahead of me. There's a lot of anger in the parents and the children, and I think there had been a lack of leadership, which meant that teachers' expectations really needed to be addressed. And so it was pretty chaotic.
Yeah, okay. So just to go back to something that you mentioned there, I just looked it up because I've not heard of the Battle of Lewisham previously. Would you mind just to share a little bit about what that was? What happened there? Because people might not be aware.
So it's a really important point about Lewisham, that it was a point where there was a National Front march, and people of Lewisham stood up, and there was a battle, and basically the racists were driven out of Lewisham. So we do study it in our curriculum in Year 5 because we're very much about looking at resistance generally, because we believe that educating for resistance is a really important part of our work, but also looking at British resistance to whether that's sexism, racism is a really important part of our work. So yeah, it's a really powerful moment in history for Lewisham. And it's, it happened in the 70s. So people here in our community remember it. I wasn't living in London at the time, but I'm really proud of Lewisham and what Lewisham did to stand up to racism.
Yeah, it's incredible. So I'm just looking at it up on Wikipedia. So it says 500 members of the National Front attempted to march from New Cross to Lewisham, and they were met by around 4,000 people. And like you say, there was a battle. There was violence ensued, and as you say, the racists were driven out. And so can you paint a bit of a picture just to set the scene of like what? Because I'm not from London. I lived there a while ago, but I don't really know much about the local geography. So could you explain a little bit about Catford and Lewisham and what the area is like?
Okay, so it is changing because, as Dorling would say, London is being gentrified, not in my school. So my school is not very much. That's not true. There is gentrification happening. But essentially, we're about 60, 70, 65 plus percent BME, with our biggest community is Black Caribbean, then Black African, and then a whole sort of range of Asian, that's Chinese, Indian, subcontinent community. We have got Eastern European children, and white British is our smallest community. But that's changed slightly. So we've got more white British children coming, but we've got more white British from a different social economic group. So we've always had white working class community. And by that, I mean not white working class as in people who define themselves as white working class, but white working class because they are free school meals. There's a very important distinction.
Right, thank you. Okay, and so you joined the school as a head. It was 13 years ago.
Yeah.
And you said that there was anger at the time in the parents and the children. Can you explain a bit about that? What was paint a picture of the school when you joined?
Well, the school was a failing school in the sense that it had gone into special measures. Outcomes were very poor for all children, but even more for disadvantaged children, and also for Black Caribbean pupils. And behaviour was, I would say, unruly. So there was a lot of the work happening in classes was kind of trying to maintain this sort of anger in the community. So children were acting out a lot. So there was quite a lot of violence, but then also parents were reacting quite violently. So I remember one of the first things I had to do was to deal with a case where the police had been called in because a parent had attacked a child because the school wasn't dealing with, the problems that were happening. So we went, we were on a huge journey, and also I was on a journey. I was a new head, so I didn't really know very much about what I was doing, to be honest. And so I was thinking and feeling my way through it, but always open to and never shutting down what I believe was righteous rage. as opposed to an angry mob.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so the school has been on something of a journey in the interim. Can we talk a little bit about what the school is like now, and then we'll maybe go back and talk about the journey? Because I know that one of the things that I really like about your work is that you're not into quick fixes, and we talked a lot about the sort of the idea of the superhead who can just swoop into a school and turn everything around and then swoop back out to the next school, and how problematic that idea is, and the whole idea of the leader as a hero, as a savior. And so we'll maybe get into all of that. But so Rathfern now, I mean, I know enough about Ofsted to know that we can take certain, like the grades that Ofsted give with a pinch of salt, because they're not necessarily reflective of reality. But as I understand it, Ofsted have recognised that the school is outstanding in every category, is it? And the results are phenomenal, and you're now a research school, and the disadvantage gap data is really impressive. So can you just explain a little bit about, do a better job than I just did of explaining what the school is like now?
So I'm really proud to say that the team are incredibly committed to, tackling social injustice and environmental injustice, for that matter, and committed to working with the community and empowering children to really engage with the trickiness of learning. So it's a powerful learning community, I would say, and it's always developing and innovating and, refining its approach, because teachers are very reflective and committed to their own learning. And I think there's such a deep kind of commitment to transforming inequality that it drives us to we always kind of improving our approach, because we're talking about inequality within the school, but we talk about kind of global societal inequality is very much part of the conversation and the dialogue, because teaching is so complex, and it's about all those dimensions in the classroom. Teachers are becoming so adept at teaching the maths, but at the same time making sure that the children are becoming and continuing to develop their relationship with each other and the world. And, it's so complex, but somehow we are creating this community of really powerful teachers who are really committed to improving their pedagogy, but also committed to kind of enabling children to be real citizens of the world at the same time. And that's a really important part of our work, because it's about the quality of the children that leave us literate, numerate, but and more importantly, compassionate human beings who are wanting and not because they've been indoctrinated. And this is really important. Spivak talks about the uncoercive rearrangement of desires. And I think our curriculum really enables children to do that, to start reflecting differently about who they are, how they are. And I think the adults go on that journey here.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely been my my experience. So, just for listeners' sake, so I became sort of aware of your school when we did the research informed peer review program. So this is a program that was developed by my colleague David Godfrey at UCL, and it's sort of like a bit like lesson study, where you have teachers going and observing one another, but it's across schools. So there was 3 or 4 schools involved in that program, and it was so focused around feedback. So we all spend a day going and looking at lessons in one of the schools, but we also interview teachers and interview students as well, and it's a really impressive place to come and see how things play out in terms of the classroom practice, especially as I remember around metacognition, which was something that I know has been very central to your thinking over the years, and the way that plays out, and so that the children have a really strong understanding of this. It's really transparent that the children are able to talk about these ideas. And since then, we've worked on the implementation science program, which, as you know, is my current obsession, and that's where we work with a vertical slice. So we put a team together of senior leaders, middle leaders, year group leaders, classroom teachers, teaching assistants, and around that planning table, everybody's an equal and everybody's voice is equally valued. I was so impressed by the quality of the teachers and the learning support and teaching assistants that are in the school, and how engaged they are and how energized they are, not just in doing their job to the letter, but in terms of these wider issues, and in terms of school improvement more generally. So it is a hugely impressive place to be. So let's talk a little bit about how you have taken this on this journey. Like you said, you joined, it was your first headship. You felt like you were getting into something that was a very complex, challenging situation. Where did you begin, and what were the sort of the key ideas that have shaped your thinking and the school's development through that process?
So just before I joined Rathfern, I had been at UCL doing my master's probably a couple of years before, and it was the best thing that I'd ever done. So it was way more, for me personally, a really powerful experience of learning. I did an MA in effective learning, and I had the privilege of working with people like Chris Watkins, who just revolutionized my way of defining myself as a classroom practitioner. And it was so powerful, the work that I did with him. And my dissertation was the use of learning journals with my year 6 class. And it was so transformational. And so many of those young people have kept in touch with me to this day. I mean, I got this amazing email one day just popped up, and it was from a young woman called Imogen, who had been in my class, and she said, I'm going for my MA interview today, and I wanted to tell you, and I don't know if you're still in schools or if you're working, so I want to say that I'm going to talk about you, because when you taught me to think about my learning, it just transformed who I was in that classroom. And it just, I mean, that happened recently, the email, about 2 years ago. But taking children on that journey and going on a journey myself just really convinced me over time, because my master's took me quite a while. I had children. I was a full-time deputy head. I've never had the luxury of not being able to work and study. It's always been both. But, I started to develop and trial those ideas as a deputy in my school. And I could just see how it was energizing teachers. They were starting to look at what was happening. It was bizarre. I'd been teaching by that point for over 10 years, and we'd never asked ourselves what learning was. And so I was asking these really basic questions, but people were, mesmerized because they'd never actually asked the questions themselves. So I saw what it did for the community when I was a deputy, and I was absolutely hell-bent on making sure that was a driving force in my school and really taking it to the team. So when we started to think about when things started to stabilize, but even from day one, there's no doubt about it, when you enter a school with the kind of chaos that was happening and the lack of leadership, that it was a really uncomfortable time for everybody. Learning is messy and learning is uncomfortable. And because I came in with that view from a classroom teacher perspective, but also from a head, it meant that we embraced the challenge in a way that wasn't demonizing or criminalizing everybody. But, we were having to rethink and relearn in order to change things for the better for the children. So we started to look at how we can really promote effective learning. So we did some simple things. We said, well, what makes an effective learner? And I got the staff to mind map it, to thought shower it. And then we started to develop our approach with learning attributes. And that very much was co-constructed with the team, but then developed over time.
Yeah. Okay, and so there's a couple of things that I think it would be good to pick up on. One of them is, I know that the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN SDGs, I can see them behind you on the wall there, have been very central to your curriculum development,
Yeah.
and also this idea of the 3 M's. Your sort of homespun, framework for thinking about school improvement. Which one would you like to take first?
Maybe the 3 M's, because that sort of explains why we've kind of adopted and are developing the SDGs. So, yeah, I don't even know how long ago it was, but I did start my doctorate, but then I had a personal problem. So I just thought, no, I can't do the doctorate as well. But it was during this time that I started to try and conceptualize what we were doing at Rathfern. And I was sort of trying to distill from it what the key kind of elements were of our approach. And I came up, I did lots of reading, and well, obviously metacognition was one of the key elements. So, metacognition had to be a central part, because that was about how you really develop that learner agency, and you really empower both children and teachers to be able to plan, monitor, and regulate how they're approaching their role. But then the other element, two really important elements for us, were moral purpose. And I say moral, so I've always asked myself, why am I doing this job? Because actually, I've always wanted to change the world. So I'm quite a political animal, I would say. But then when I found teaching, I thought, well, you can combine the two, and you can actually work with people to see what needs to be changed. You can't make anyone do anything, but you can present, scenarios, the situation, so that people decide how they're going to act. And for me, it is a moral journey. It's moral because children are so important, because they are the future. It's moral because we make that difference in the classroom. So our moral purpose acknowledges that, we don't all start at the same position, that there are systemic forces to do with race and class which really hamper children and adults' journey. And unless we acknowledge those, we're not really ever going to tackle anything, because we'll just keep looking at the results. Everything is about evidence, and that evidence is always about pupils' outcomes. Well, they won't change if we don't start by looking at where does the injustice start. So, and I think that's critically woven into our kind of commitment to intelligence as being malleable. So I have read a lot of Dweck's work, and I love it, and it's really important. And it's been really critical, I think, for education, but it can only go so far if you don't look at what, for me, are the roots of people's either conscious or unconscious kind of alignment with intelligence. Because for me, intelligence is very much linked to class and race, and then gender. And it's got a historical root, which is kind of we've been decolonising for a long time, way before kind of the recent sort of interest in it. Because for me, decolonising is understanding that historical systemic race and classism that kind of puts that ceiling on poor and black, non-white, non-English speaking children. So those are the 3 M's. So the moral purpose drives the commitment to malleable intelligence, because without it, you can easily and do easily default back to fixed intelligence for certain groups of children. And the metacognition reminds us all the time to plan for those biases, to monitor them, and to regulate them. So that's how the 3 M's come together in our approach.
It's absolutely brilliant. I love it. And it makes such sense. Like you say, like taken separately, each of the 3 M's, metacognition, moral purpose, malleable intelligence, it makes sense to have a clear idea, but it's the way that they interact that makes them so interesting. And so with regard to moral purpose, I remember you saying a while ago that if people don't get angry at interview, then you just think, well, I'm not going to employ you, because if you're not angry about what's going on, then you're not paying attention.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I mean, I am an angry person, and I think I've learned over the years to communicate that in a way that is, I guess, acceptable. But it's that anger that I recognize in my children and my community. So there's this kind of, for me, a really deep kind of almost like communion that I have, which gives me the courage really to keep on, because it's tough. It is really tough working in the community with high levels of kind of anger, which is rooted in a historical kind of mistrust, which is rooted in colonialism, post-colonialism, slavery, indentured labor, all of that kind of, and that daily experience of whiteness, which dominates and diminishes those of us that experience it. So if you're not, so I am an angry person, so I can relate to, and I don't judge people for being angry. In fact, I kind of celebrate it, and I, talk to the team around about the importance of having passion in this situation. And there's a lot of people who think if you're too passionate, you can't be practical. And, if you're too angry, you can't think straight. Well, the starting point is if you're not angry. So one of our questions at interview, crudely put, is dumb rich kids outperform poor smart kids? And if the interview doesn't really respond to that in a way that makes me think this is something that they're going to be committed to throughout their journey, then we can't recruit them, because they don't have that kind of resilience and that kind of, commitment to, working with what is essentially a challenging community, because our children do not come from, most of our children come from deeply uncomfortable sort of life experiences, and they need to work with teachers who have the kind of love and the commitment to understand that and turn that into a kind of learning power, and not write it off as kind of, when children are angry, they shut down, and they can't think straight. But that's very easily misjudged if you don't have the moral purpose, if you don't believe intelligence is malleable, as children not responding and not being intelligent, and therefore you put a ceiling on those children. So my team, all of them have a story which helps them to understand and to commit to, kind of lifelong commitment. Because I'm not about creating teachers. I want all my teachers to be head teachers one day, if that's what they want to do. But I want them to be the kind of head teachers who have that lifelong love for tackling inequality. And that's got to be at the heart of what we're doing in education.
Yes, I agree completely, and it's so refreshing to hear you speaking like this, because it's often presented almost like as a sort of, it's like in academic terms, it's like, oh, this is just a graph that we need to, make it look a bit less unequal. But it's not a graph, is it? It's like people's lived experiences. And I agree with you that if you haven't really been exposed to those life stories, and if you haven't been at the thick end of this, then you're not going to feel that. But I can see how that anger really burns in lots of the work that you do. And anger is often sort of, it's seen as a negative thing, but anger is an energy, right? I think there's a song or book or something with that title, and lots of people have talked about that, about how it fuels them to go further, and to address this stuff, not just in some academic way, but in a way that just you feel in your bones, every day. So that's...
And I think that sometimes for me is missing, when I hear people speak, there feels like there's a disconnect between the heart and the mind. And we are heart, body, and mind, and therefore sort of, if you don't feel it, it's very hard to. And I think children and my parents are a very good judge of that, so they do intuitively understand and will listen in a way that I think for other people, perhaps the historical kind of leadership team, they didn't believe in them, which made them more angry, because I think they thought, this is a day job. This is, I don't think you're really trying to understand my child. And that's often what parents say. What we know in Lewisham is that the lowest achieving groups also have the highest rates of exclusion. And those families definitely feel that people aren't listening and that they don't understand their children, and the policies and the practices within school actually escalate the anger rather than de-escalate it. And we're about de-escalating and giving children the kind of tools to really be able to have good executive functioning skills so that they can think clearly, move beyond the anger as well, and be really productive in their lives. I read somewhere that somebody said, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. And I think that's so powerful. And we stand for something.
Yeah.
We stand for kind of social justice, and we don't fall for anything, because we will ask questions. Well, why should we be doing that?
Yes, I love it. I love it. And so that's moral purpose. On the malleable intelligence thing, that's something that I spoke about a little bit with Rachel McFarlane in a recent episode. And she was talking about the importance of that question is often really about what's going on in the minds of teachers and the things that they say, and the sort of the unconscious biases that sometimes come out, where teachers say things like, oh, that's all well and good, but that's not going to work for these kids. They sort of, in a well-meaning way, they sort of think, oh, I don't want to, push these kids. I don't want to impose middle-class values on them, for example, and talk about going to university. And so with 100 different labels on, teachers, with the best will in the world, can sometimes make excuses for their kids, and therefore, that horrible phrase that Michael Gove loves so much, the soft bigotry of low expectations. There's a grain of truth in there.
Yeah, there is. I think the problem is that the whole way of operating kind of is a bit of a contradiction on that. So yeah, I think heads, leaders, ultimately they have the responsibility, I think, to model and to model that commitment to malleable intelligence. So the way that they treat their team, can then be reenacted within the classroom. So if you're judging lessons, I mean, we haven't judged lessons for years, because the same kind of fixed intelligence, this is an outstanding teacher, this is a good teacher, this is a satisfactory teacher, that then plays out in teachers. So teachers, what we know is that teachers teach the way they were taught, unless you do something, unless you really develop metacognitive teachers who plan for disrupting that way of teaching, who can monitor that they're not going to default back to the way that they were taught, and then do and regulate those tendencies. We need to model that as leaders with our team, and then it's much more likely there'll be an alignment within the classroom. But I think malleable intelligence is such a challenge to deeply enact within the system. I think it's the hardest thing in some ways to enact, because the historical legacy of this country and many many countries across the world has been contingent on the dehumanization of people according to their class or their race. Yeah. And how do you dehumanize? You say these people don't have enough intelligence, therefore they can be exploited. And the whole way our economic system works is contingent upon that. Kind of the post-colonial, the globalized system is about making people so obsessed with becoming consumers and turning them into kind of just an obsessive kind of, impulse to buy. I am what I am who I am because of what I have. All of that is playing out in education as well. And I think what it does is it reducing people to consumers is another way of dehumanizing people. So for me, there are a lot of parallels. So people who stop and think, do I really need 3 cars? This is what cars are doing to the planet. Do I need 3 cars? You know, people's intelligence, I think, is being enacted upon because somehow the system is working to make you believe you need it. And we need to educate children if we're going to save the planet for them to think differently about what they need, what any of us need for that matter. I don't know if I've answered your question, but for me, that links to malleable intelligence because I think the system is the virus of capitalism is just so sophisticated at replicating itself in a way, disguising itself in a way that still reduces us to being slaves of something.
Yeah, absolutely. And then with the third one, with metacognition, I remember you saying before that like this is more about what's going on within the mind of individual teachers within the minds of young people themselves, because this is the emancipatory mechanism. The metacognition is the way in which you can break out of these shackles that have been placed around you by capitalist societies, by societal structures, by class and by race and so on. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah, because, you know, you can reform capitalism, okay, but you'll only get a softer version of it. And within that system, there's always got to be the exploited and the exploiter. So how do you disrupt that fundamental relationship of inequality? Because we keep looking at graphs of inequality, but we're not getting to the root of it. And, you know, I know some people think, well, you know, you're in education, you're not a politician. But people in education enact policy. Policy is created by politicians. So, you know, you cannot reduce, you know, schools can't be removed from that system. But the way my passion for metacognition is from an emancipatory pedagogy. I began the journey thinking, well, maybe this is the way we can school-proof people because, you know, schools are fundamentally unjust places that they just replicate the inequality. But if you create children and teachers who can plan for the kind of problematic nature of relationships and then monitor how they are enacting their pedagogy, which is in a more just way, then they can, you know, there's much more chance that children will not be damaged by that system. And for children themselves, you know, even if the teacher is biased, so my experience of teachers was regularly being treated as if I, you know, just couldn't do anything. And I didn't have the tools to say, you know, I didn't have that clarity. I couldn't plan my day and my thinking. I couldn't monitor how I was acting in a, you know, in a situation. I would shut down. I did believe, you know, the things that teachers were telling me about my intelligence, and therefore I couldn't regulate myself. So for me, metacognition is really critical to liberate children, but also teachers from oppressive kind of historical processes, but also give teachers a way of, you know, looking at some of the things that we're being told work in the classroom with a more critical kind of eye. So yes, it's really important that we're mindful of cognitive load theory, because, you know, that's something that has become the zeitgeist. People talk about it, and it's really important that we understand how much children can take on and remember. But also the metacognitive teacher understands there's more to learning than just regurgitating and remembering. So the metacognitive teacher brings in the other dimensions. Teaching is the most complex thing in the world because you have to operate on multi-dimensions, and if you're not metacognitive, I don't believe you can do that. You'll be a very linear teacher, you know, input, output, you know, kind of way. And that's not truly educating children in your classroom.
Yes. Yeah, it's a very sophisticated way of thinking about the set of problems that we face. I love how those 3 M's fit together. It's a brilliant thing. I know that you disrupted your doctorate, but I hope that you'll pick it up sometime. Have you written about the 3 M's?
In part, but I think, the good thing is that because the three M's have become very much a part of the way we do things here at Rathfern, I'm learning so much from how adults are interpreting it in their own way. So, sometimes I'll sit and I will interview my staff just because I'm sort of checking in on how they're seeing things. And one of my team said to me, which I thought I'd never thought about that. She said, everybody's committed to the three M's, Naheeda, but some people have more moral purpose, and some people have a better grasp on the metacognition, and maybe we need a mixture of that in people. And I was like, well, I hadn't thought about it like that. And this teacher was saying, well, maybe some people don't really understand metacognition, but their moral purpose will help them and drive them to want to understand it. Whereas maybe some people join us because they've got this love of metacognition, but they don't really have the moral purpose, and because they haven't got moral purpose, they keep reenacting the kind of fixed view of intelligence. So she sort of got me to think about it in a different way. So when I do come back to it, I think I'll be able to look at it in probably a richer way than I did, because that's learning, that we become, hopefully when I come back to it, I'll be looking at the three M's through how it's transformed my teachers and my children, because it is about the adults, and it's got to be about the adults as much as the children in the school.
Yeah, of course. And that's something that's been developing in my own thinking a lot in recent years. And I've become at least as interested in adult learning as I am in the learning of young people. And to go back to some of the things that you were touching on earlier about school proofing and so on, and the way in which schools reproduce inequality, this is something that I'm hoping that this podcast will help to shine a light on, because it's often just it's like taken as an unquestionable good that schools are a good thing, and that they themselves are emancipatory mechanisms, and that they are places that young people can go that get qualifications, they get love and support and pastoral care, and we do our very best, and we can't help them all, but despite everything, we we do our best to get them to go off and have a good start in the world. And that's one way of looking at it, and that's certainly what many people believe, right? And that's what gets many teachers out of bed in the morning, that they think that they're going to, go to school and do a good job and to help young people, of course. And all of that is simultaneously true, but also we can see other ways in which schools do damage, right? That they reproduce inequality, like you say, and often this is not in the mainstream, and when people raise it, they are dismissed and shouted down as like, oh, you're talking down the profession. I can remember a while ago on Twitter, I was sort of saying something about how, I think I wrote a blog about it, about how it was quite a simple point really, about how because classrooms are sort of top-down micromanaged places, and we tell kids what to do and when and how and so on all the time, and this is what success will look like, and these are the learning intentions for this lesson, that the young people become sort of helpless, right? And they can become that sometimes they ask all these helpless questions. And we opened our book with this. I asked a question on Twitter: what are the types of helpless things that kids ask? And we were inundated with people saying, "Oh, my pencil's broken," or where should I put the rubbish and stuff like this. Like they're asking these helpless questions because they sort of become infantilized by this process, and they become very dependent on the teachers. And I was sort of making this point and saying, learning to learn is a way we can get around this. We can teach them how to help themselves. And somebody was saying, oh, you're talking down the teaching profession. We're trying to do a good job, and you're just making out like we're making kids dependent. But there are more serious arguments even than that. I know that you're aware of Diane Ray's amazing work and her book Miseducation, which goes into great forensic detail about the ways in which schools reproduce inequality. And there's other papers. There was the well-known paper by Clive Harbour, Schooling as Violence, and as Violence against the individual and against, Schooling as Violence, How Schools Harm Pupils and Society. Interestingly, Becky Francis, who's now the head of the EEF, wrote a paper a while ago with Martin Mills called Schools as Damaging Organizations. So, and lots of these wider sort of conversations about like the way in which schools, it's not all just in the pros column. There are pros and cons here, and there are things that we can do to rethink and reshape education to get stuff out of that cons column. And we could have a whole conversation about that. But that's partly what I'm hoping to do with these conversations, is to open that up and to have a really honest, robust, hard-headed look at this, across the piece, the good and the bad.
I do agree with you, and I've been listening to a number of your podcasts, and some of them with trepidation. The Cunningham one, I thought, I just don't think I can cope with this. But it was so important because my experience of school was that it was a toxic place. I didn't want to be in school. And I think that we can't kid ourselves. There are certain people who perhaps join the profession because you do have power over vulnerable people. But, you have to, this is why asking what we are doing and why we are doing it, and not just always, why is so important rather than, sorry, what? Because if we keep asking ourselves why, we can kind of check in on ourselves and be more kind of aware of when you're organized, because schools are places of control, whether we like it or not. But how do we keep ourselves in check? And to what extent is that control damaging to children? It's the kind of critical question you ask yourself as a parent when you watch. Children are just such amazing natural learners. They really are. They ask so many questions, and what on earth happens to them? They enter school asking questions and they leave not wanting to. So what is it? We're trying to really think deeply about that, to keep that kind of passion and interest. And one way for us is around this whole commitment we have to social action. So something that we do very much as a part of our work is the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is the way we talk to our children about, there are these 17 goals, though if my children had it, there would be 18 that have to be achieved by 2030. That's within their lifetime. And it really motivates them with a purpose. Why do, this is something that they can work on, be involved. It gives them, the saddest thing about school is that some children just don't see the point of being here. And that's criminal. They spend a lot of time here and they shouldn't be here because they are forced to be here. They should come because, and they do come to Rathfern because they really love being here, because there's a sense of they have a purpose. That there are these 17 goals that the world needs to achieve, not just for them, but for the rest of humanity. And they learn, how they are going to grow into citizens that will have a purpose in the world. And for us, that's a really important part, and it's something that school just didn't do for me. I had to find that meaning for myself, and I think we're not in, it's really important for me to stress we are not indoctrinating children. We present the goals and we give them opportunities and kind of scenario where they problem solve and they look at finding solutions. And I think education must be a place where we empower children to have a purpose beyond kind of us, that goes then into their kind of life after school, into their life with their, because what we want to teach children to do is how to live within the world. So, and that isn't just the world of the school. Our values, our core values, should be something that the children take with them into their life on the street and the bus and in their homes, that are going to really make this planet a better place for everybody, I guess, is a really important part. And it's something that when you only look at effect size, you can't really judge that part of our schools kind of mission, well, not mission, I hate that word, our ambition for the children, really, and for ourselves, because I think, let's not kid ourselves. We don't know all the answers. And I think, we are the reason the planet is in the mess it is in. And I regularly say that to children, we don't have the solutions. You need to help us kind of find the solutions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, because the current adults who are in charge of the world, just don't seem to have and it's a wonderful challenge for children. It fills them with a real sense of, they've got a purpose. They can find solutions that adults, in maths, the adults know the answers, let's say, but they don't know the answers to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's a really powerful, and it drives our children to see a purpose then in the maths and the science and the other subjects they teach, because these are the children who are making the future, and the future is to live sustainably. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to live in a world that isn't unequal, and these are the children who hopefully will help us do that.
Yeah, so I know it's going to be difficult to sort of summarize, because the Sustainable Development Goals are very central to so much of your thinking. Just in case, if there's anybody who isn't aware of this, these are 17 goals that have been sort of agreed upon by scientists and the United Nations, and it's things like clean water and sanitation, gender equality is in there, action on the climate, and so on. And that was why. So you said a moment ago that you think that your students think that there should be 18. That was linked to the fact that there is one for gender equality. And I read one of your, was it a year 6 student, wrote an incredible letter to the United Nations to say there should be an 18th one.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, we talk a lot about justice here, and obviously racial justice, and more so, everyone's talking about it since the tragic murder of George Floyd. But one of my year 6 students, he's an amazing scholar. He wrote a letter to he came to see me. He said he was troubled. And I said, well, let's talk. What's troubling? And he said, I've been looking at these SDGs since I joined this school, and there's something missing. And none of the adults had seen this, by the way. This was this child. And everyone I've spoken to since has said, wow, yeah, we've been working on the Sustainable Development Goals and none of us have seen it. So he wants an SDG 18, and he wants that to be racial justice. He said there's gender inequality, we should look at race inequality. And I'm, really proud that a Rathfern scholar has come up with that kind of gap in the Sustainable Development Goals. But the reason they're so important at Rathfern is, if you look at Sustainable Development Goal, is it 16, peace, justice and strong institutions? So, the idea of war. So the only time we really talk about war is when we do World War II. And actually, wars across the world, apart from the shocking loss of lives, costs the planet a huge amount of money. For anybody who doesn't know about the campaign against the arms trade, get involved in them because they're brilliant. And they've done so much analysis on, just what we can do in a civil society with what we pay for, say, one nuclear missile. So they do this really amazing sort of cost analysis, and you can share that with children, and you can say, one of our moral questions is it ever just to go to war? So the children then look at which wars are just and unjust, but we also look at the kind of economy of war and warmongering for that matter. And I think from my point of view, if we're going to make our children citizens of a democracy, informed, then they need to make an informed decision about whether they really want a government who's going to spend a significant amount of the nation's wealth on just piling up nuclear weapons. Now, they can't do that in the current national curriculum. So unless you look at Sustainable Development Goals and you bring that up when you're looking at war and you link it to SDG 17, then, you can't, it's not 16, isn't it, SDG 16, then you can't have that conversation with children. And I keep coming back to the point that we are not indoctrinating, but we are presenting children with the opportunity to reframe, to rethink about how they want to be in this world, whether they want to be, informed citizens or just compliant citizens. And we believe it's our duty to give them information that makes them able to make informed decisions.
Yes, yeah, and it's an incredibly well written letter. This thing that this Rathfern scholar has written to the UN. Hopefully, there will be a reply coming forthwith. Who knows?
We hope so. We've sent it to a number of places, but we've not heard anything yet.
This is all just so fascinating. I could talk about it all day, but I want to get onto the rethinking education part of the conversation. And as you know, I like to get to know the guest a little bit and to understand what has shaped you as a person and what your own experience of childhood and of school and later education was like. So let's go there next, if we may. So can you just explain a little bit about your own experience of school and what your early life was like?
I think the word that describes school for me was othering. I think I've always, my whole life experience was just feeling othered and never kind of belonging in school, in the playground, probably at university as well. And I think that, back then, it just didn't occur to the school to make any attempt to understand children and who they were and what they brought with them into the school and how that impacted on how they operated as learners. So, yes, school, I think, othered me, and I think had very low expectations. And I think, lots of people who fail the 11 plus, they either kind of go with that, view of their intelligence, or they challenge it. And I think, luckily for me, I've always been quite angry. So for me, it was kind of challenging that judgment on my intelligence in a kind of slow and steady way, I think, through an internal conversation with self. So I learned optimistic self-talk very early, and I just use that to navigate my way, and it's something that we very much try and develop in our children. Yeah, so education was not a positive experience in any way. I didn't feel I could ever be myself, and I think that's criminal, really.
Yes. Yeah, so we spoke about this a bit last week, didn't we? I don't know how much of this you're sort of like happy to share, but there's an incredible bit of like a sort of an instance where you so you said you didn't pass the 11 plus,
No.
And so you went to what I guess was a secondary modern.
Yeah.
And you said that it was horrible, and you described it as toxic and racist, and that it was somehow like Lord of the Flies, that you're putting all of these underprivileged kids, poor kids together, and you're just sort of letting it play out.
Yeah.
Some sort of unethical experiment.
It was. I mean, the fact I missed school for a year and nobody asked where I was. So I actually left the country, and it wasn't in the day where, now it would be a child missing in education. And when I came back, I was sort of, before going to Pakistan, I was pretty corpulent, actually, because I just lived off a diet of rubbish. And then when I went to Pakistan, I didn't eat. So I came back and I was like half the size, had the biggest headlights you could imagine. And my teacher she didn't even ask me where I'd been. She was just like, "Oh, you're back, are you? Oh, yeah." I just, it was kind of disbelief that nobody actually bothered to. So that's how unimportant we were really in that school. But anyway, it was that year that had such an impact. So, I've got a lot of time for people who talk about the power of not being in education, because for a year I wasn't in education. I learned so much. I learned so much about what I could be by being, firstly, in a world where I was a visible majority. So I went to Pakistan. Everybody was brown like me, and the psychological. I remember arriving, whether it was Lahore or Karachi, I can't remember, but just the psychological kind of. I almost felt the air just coming, the hot air coming out. I just felt like a different person because nobody was really looking at me anymore. So I looked the same as everybody else. And that feeling of being part of the visible majority was, I think, psychologically transforming for me. I was also coming to a country where I couldn't speak the language, so it was really weird. I understood bits of it, but I couldn't speak. So I was in a silent period for about 3 months. But anyway, the short and long of spending a year in Pakistan was I came back and I suddenly, woke up. I felt like I'd come out of a deep sleep. I think I mentioned to you earlier that I lost both my parents at 6.5. And so I think I had been in kind of a post-traumatic sort of state of being. And that's another thing that's really dear to my heart, understanding that sort of dimension of children. So I didn't know it was 11 plus, failed my 11 plus. Wasn't really, I was alive, but not present at school. But that year away brought me back to be very present in the education system. And I actually noticed that the teacher didn't notice that I hadn't been in school for a year, which was quite amusing, because I think before I'd been, I probably wouldn't even thought that was a big deal. So I knew anyway that I needed to go to university. Somehow, some message had got into my head. I needed to go to university. I didn't want a traditional life. I did not want an arranged marriage. When we were in Pakistan, I saw my sister. Because we didn't have a mum and dad, we were considered to have a British passport, and therefore we had some kind of like wealth attached to us. I was like, oh God, no, that can't happen to my sister. So I'm conscious not to promote stereotypes as well. So that may not have happened. It's what I believed would have happened. So I saw a purpose to become educated, decided that I needed to take O-levels, spoke to the school about it, and they said no. And the short and long of it is, through battling with them, they probably thought I was really insolent. I did get them to agree to me doing dual entry. So I was able to take O-levels as well as CSEs, but I had to teach myself the syllabus. So it was tough, but I did pass. And I went off to a grammar school, got good enough A-levels to go to university.
Yeah, okay. That was the short version of that story. I heard the full version of it last week when we spoke, and it is quite remarkable. Would you be happy to go into that in a little bit more depth about? So you went to you're in the secondary modern. You went to knock on the head teacher's door. You were diminutive, 14 years old, and you were like, I need to do O-levels. Can you just give us the sort of slightly longer version of that story?
Okay, so yeah, I knocked on the door. Bear in mind I was bricking myself all the way there, because I don't know what courage or what was going on in my head, because this wasn't a conversation I'd had with anyone. Remember, I was then under a legal guardianship with an older brother, so I didn't have a mum and dad. But I just had this voice in my head, right? Just go talk to somebody. So I thought, well, who to go to? It wasn't the head teacher. I went to the deputy head, knocked on the door, and I just remember this very long, narrow room with the two adults sitting at the end and me being very tiny and standing far away, and them sort of just looking above their desk. Yes, what do you want? I said, I need to talk to you about O-levels. And they just both looked at you. They said, O-levels? They looked at me. I said, yes, I need to do O-levels. And I think I was asked to go closer to the desk. And they were talking about me in third person. So I said, I need to take O-levels. One of them said, she said she needs to take O-levels. And the other one said, she said that. And then they would then talk. One of them would talk to me and take it in turn. So it was a weird conversation. No. We don't do O-levels here. We are a secondary modern. She doesn't understand, they would say to each other, as if I wasn't there. It was so weird. So they sent me packing, saying no. But I just wasn't happy with that. So I went back the next day, or maybe a couple of days later, I can't remember the time frame, same conversation. She's back. She wants to take O-levels. You can't take O-levels. But I have, and I think I was getting emotional now. I was like, but I have to go to the grammar school. I need to go to university. And they were sort of shaking their heads at me. No. And I didn't give up. I think I went a third or a fourth time, and they both were so furious with me. And they pretended they didn't hear me knocking, but I kept knocking. And then they said that I would have to pay for them. And that was, for me, kind of the end of the line, because we just didn't have money. to pay, and I just didn't even want to go home and ask. So I didn't ask my brother, but I somehow managed to find money for the phone box. So I rang my sister who lived in London with my 10p or whatever it was, and just burst into tears. And she thought probably the worst had happened, like the electricity had been cut off again or something like that. I said, no, it's not that. And have you got enough food to eat? Yeah. My brother nicked food and we've got food to eat. So what is it? And I told her this story, and she said, well, I'm really sorry, darling, we don't have a lot of money. But the good news is that her husband did pay. He paid for me to do 5 double entries. So I was able to get 5 O levels, which is the minimum I needed to go to the grammar school, which is where I went. And that's a whole other story.
Yeah, that's so fascinating and incredibly, just like strong-willed of you. I'd love to hear where this like optimistic self-talk came from, where people keep, we were talking about unconscious bias earlier. That's just like conscious bias, isn't it? It's like spoken out there. None of these children will ever come to anything, and our job is
really
to just,
was.
yeah. Absolutely incredible. So, we're sort of moving in the right direction. When you look over a longer time period, at least it's unconscious now that what's left of those sorts of biases. And also an echo of that earlier bit of conversation where you were talking about school as othering and school as being a problematic place, but also you totally bought into and still buy into the idea that school can also, and education is a mechanism for emancipation and for changing your narrative. So that's amazing. And this was in a place, when we spoke last week, you were saying that your main survival strategy was to hide at this school, that it was a very sort of dangerous place. And I don't know if you've listened to a previous episode with Tim Taylor. He had a very similar experience. He went to a one form entry not even one form entry. There was about 6 kids in his primary school. His dad was the head teacher. 6 kids of all ages, and then he went to this like 2,000 kid secondary school, secondary modern, and he was just like, this is not safe, and was just sort of in fight or flight mode the whole time. And so you used to hide away and just sort of bide your time as you were going through this. So to go from somewhere that you were in is quite an extreme place where you were feeling like not safe and othered, to be able to actually turn those circumstances around is like really quite something. I wonder where that came from. I don't know if you got any insight into that.
I don't know. I think, I just learned to navigate. I mean, you said this, chaos very early. And I think I could, I just, maybe I had a survival instinct, but I think I always knew when things were not fair. And I knew it was not fair that I was being told I couldn't do this. I knew it was not fair that I didn't have one of the things I really wanted to do actually was learn to ride a bike, and I didn't have a bike. So I stole my brother's bike. It was a chopper, and I had to do this clandestinely because I was also living in a kind of quite patriarchal situation where girls weren't supposed to ride a bike. So I always had this tendency to want to do what I shouldn't be doing. But behind everyone's back, I would take the bike out, and I was determined to come back and learn. So I think I did do it. Over 2 days, I taught myself to ride a bike, and I had the wounds to prove it. But I even had to hide those wounds. So I just had these legs covered in grazes I couldn't tell anyone about because I'd been doing this behind everyone's back. And I just had this. It wasn't fair that I didn't have a bike. My brother had a bike. It wasn't fair that I couldn't take O levels. And I think that's very much, my deep commitment to malleable intelligence is because I feel really sensitively when people don't have a belief in others linked to intelligence, probably because I experienced that so aggressively. For me, I've got a real, very deep, nuanced kind of sensitivity to that. So I see it in practice, in conversation all the time. And I think that is linked to the 3 M's. It's about that moral purpose, not just an intellectual commitment to, everybody should believe that, in a growth mindset, it's so deeply rooted in kind of kind of societal inequality that we've got to make the link with the two. But where it's come from me is, I guess, no sink or I had to survive it. It's I could see what may happen to me if I didn't. And I think that when you have a traumatic childhood, it also desensitizes you sometimes to some, because I think I took a lot of risks. And I think when, maybe if I hadn't had that trauma, maybe I would have been more hesitant. But there was nothing what was I going to lose? When you've kind of lost something so significant in your life, you've got a different perspective on it.
Yeah, so you sort of, it left you fearless in some sense, and I know that you said that similarly, that like nothing frightens you about some of the issues that you're dealing with. Can sometimes be really challenging when you're dealing with people with mental health problems and so on. It can be, and lots of, like you say, about anger, you can see how this is carried through into the work that you do now, that nothing seems to faze you. And so
I love that Maya Angelou poem, Life Doesn't Frighten Me. And I teach that a lot. I did teach as a year 6 teacher because I really wanted children not to be frightened by life. And I mean, obviously it's a poem, but it is a fabulous poem. And I think, when you can turn, I remember when I was little thinking, my shoes don't fit me, they've got holes in them. You have to numb yourself to so much material discomfort, as well as kind of emotional and mental discomfort. And it does give you a resilience. And I think that's where I'm able to commune with my community, because I do have that, lived experience of, the challenges that they go through. And, when, even back in the early days when I had a lot of young lads raging or, wrecking my room, there was never a sense in me that I had to meet them with an anger. It was very much wait for them to get to a place where they could use their executive functioning, and I could have that conversation with them and then get them to rethink about things. But, bring parents into that conversation in a way that was not dehumanizing or blaming the parents, but working with them together to get to the root of where this anger was coming from. And having been an angry person and probably going to be one till the day I die, I'm not frightened by life, but I'm not frightened by anger. And I think it's a really positive, it shows, shows that you care, whatever it is you're getting angry about, you care about something. And that's really important. You're a living, sentient human being.
Yeah. And anger, like intelligently expressed, like there's nothing
Exactly.
more powerful, is there? There's nothing more powerful. You don't want to just be raging, but when you can channel it, when you have the ability to do that. So let's go back to, so you mentioned earlier that the grammar school was a whole other story. I don't know whether you want to get into that, but first of all, when I was asking you the other day about moments of significant learning, and it seems like one that arose around about the same time was you reading To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, I don't even know where that came from, actually. I just picked it up. Don't know whether, because I wasn't actually in primary school, I wasn't allowed to use the library because I wasn't deemed a reader. And, so all of these barriers were so problematic for me and so damaging. So I don't know where it came from anyway, but it did. It resonated for me because it was about racism in the US, and it articulated for me my lived experience. And I suddenly wanted to read that book. And, racism was such a daily experience for me. It was either members of the public or, children at school regularly being racist, or, at my secondary school, the teachers were so explicitly racist. They would say, we really don't like the blacks in Moss Side, but, Naheeda, you're okay because you're Asian and you're quiet. And I would just be sitting there knowing that this was not right. Yeah, the grammar school was a real disappointment to me because I'd worked so hard to get there, and it was a grammar school. So, it was embodying the kind of fixed nature of intelligence. So when I got there, I was kind of, here's me thinking I've got my O levels, I'm going in. Actually, I got there and I felt really unintelligent. I was treated very differently by the teachers. I just couldn't relate to anybody. So yet again, I just had this sense of being this outsider. And I think that's probably another significant thing that defines me, is always being an outsider looking in. But I think that has a really liberatory quality to it, because I think when you've never felt like you've belonged, when you are an outsider, it gives you a way of being able to be quite brave in the way that you can look at the world and not being worried by offending people, because you don't belong to them anyway. You're not part of any group, so you can, be bold. I remember when I became a deputy, the head said to me, there's a couple of things you can't do. You've got to stop wearing. I was quite rebellious in the way I dressed. I wore stripy tights and things that also are a bit crazy. And I remember him saying to me, no, you can't do that. I really like the way you think, and I think you're going to be a great asset, but you can't do these things. And that just made me so angry. I thought, who is this guy? Telling me what I can. And I went to a meeting which kind of summed it up. And he was there, and there were 4 white men. And he said to me, go and make tea. And I just said, no. And he looked at me in horror. He said, pardon? I said, no, make it yourself. And I think it was my first week of being a deputy. And then we all went. So I said, no, make it yourself. You can all make your own tea. So we went to the room, and there was this urn, and it was, the kind of tension was just palpable. Everyone was pouring themselves a cup of tea, but all these white men were really angry. And he didn't speak to me in the whole meeting, my head. But the next morning, he called me to his office, and he was not happy. And it was like, what is your problem? Why would you not make a cup of tea? I said, well, why should I? And that's another conversation. But, all of these experiences, multiple experiences of, that was sexism and racism. I don't know what else, misogyny. I don't know. It just reminded me that you can never, ever get comfortable, Naheeda. You are always going to be walking on a precipice. You will always have a thorn in your flesh, and you kind of learn to live with that, because it's going to keep you focused on that moral purpose.
Thank you. Yes, that's fascinating. And so to go back to the significant learning thing, you painted a picture last week when we spoke about you sitting on this plastic sofa. It was quite a vivid image that you had, this being an early morning riser, reading To Kill a Mockingbird, and how you said that you were transformed, that you couldn't put it down. And you described, I wrote down what you said. It said that your lived experience, you realised, could be something that you could understand better through reading a book, and that it made you realize that you could escape your material reality through reading.
Yeah, and I think I've always sort of, as a teacher, really wanted to kind of, in a bit of the Freire way, get education to live, give children that opportunity to transcend their material and live, kind of struggle into something that can be really very beautiful. So I think, it really was. I mean, life was materially very challenging for us. So there was no heating and things like that. And we lived up north, so it was cold and always raining. But, so when I would wake up in the morning, I was always cold, and sitting on our plastic sofas was really uncomfortable. But that one experience of just getting lost in this book for the first time, I mean, it's quite late in life for that to happen, isn't it? But, the fact that it happened, and it was about race and racism, and suddenly I just thought, oh, this doesn't just happen to me, it happens to other people. And that universality of kind of struggle kind of created, I think, the spark of wanting to be in solidarity with other people who were in struggle. So, when I went to university, I was really, even though I was supposed to be studying science, I was far more involved in the politics of apartheid and third world first, looking at injustice, because I wanted to I wanted to depersonalize my experience. I didn't just want it to be about me. I wanted to understand that I was one voice in a chorus of billions of people who were suffering from injustice, and therefore, a bit like they are the few, we are the many. So I think I learned very early on through that books, education were a way of connecting with kind of wider humanity, to reduce inequality. So it was a really powerful learning moment for me, and took me into a journey to, to be in solidarity with those others. It kind of drew the line for me of, which side are you on, the oppressor or the oppressed? And I just knew I was always oppressed, so I could never be an oppressor. So I've always, sought to kind of, and I think it's really important when you are as a head teacher, and I'm not that uncomfortable with the word head teacher, I think, because I don't see it as being a power thing. I see it as a huge responsibility, a huge privilege to be always kind of looking and checking that we are, working along the lines of our agreed kind of values and kind of purpose. So I don't have that, but it just, I think being in this position of power, it's really important that you know which side you're on, and I am part of the oppressed and always will be in solidarity with that. So I couldn't then turn into a kind of agent of oppression.
Yes. Yeah, I don't think there's any danger of that happening.
We have to be mindful.
Yeah, we do indeed. Well, power's intoxicating, right? Like more than a few people have had their heads turned by the ability to make things happen. Okay, so is there anything else? As you know, I'm really interested in this idea of significant learning.
Yeah, I think the MA, I think I touched on that. I think working with Chris Watkins, and so, you go through university and then you hit, and I was, going, and I, the story of why I became a teacher is another story, because it wasn't really on the cards, really. I think I just wanted to join a revolutionary military arm of probably the ANC, but I ended up becoming a teacher. So when you get, come out of university, I did really well. I actually ended up getting a first and whatever, because at that point I really was ready and I was really thinking. And actually I had another terrible bereavement at the time. I lost my sister to suicide, and it was my final year. And, yet again, there was just another reminder that the world is deeply unfair, and it kind of, just opened my eyes up to, because my sister was incredibly bright. I mean, she passed her 11 plus with flying colours, and, she was so bright that she was put in for these S levels. Back in the day, you would do an A level and an S level. And remember, she was doing this all without any support from family. So she really was a kind of like amazing genius. But, what I learned later through her loss was, even with that cognitive sort of, because she was super intelligent, life and whatever was going on for her had its impact in her mental health. So you can't get distracted by an education that only focuses on outcomes. You really need to look at the whole child, the whole being, the whole organization. And that's kind of a really important part of my work. But so, yes, you come out of university, you become a teacher, and then you're supposed to know what you're doing in the classroom. I mean, it's insane, isn't it? I mean, you really don't know. And especially if you go into teaching and you're not a parent, I think, you really have so much learning to do. So when I started my master's, it was so liberating to be able to Actually, I was very lucky. I was in a really great school. My school was very forward thinking. I'm very committed to in kind of reducing inequality. But nevertheless, the MA was really important for me because it was about learning, in reminding myself that I was a learner and going through my own kind of, just then reminding me of re-looking at education and coming back to the purpose. So yeah, that was a significant moment. And then learning about metacognition, you know, was really significant for me, because that's how I look very differently at what I was doing in the classroom and how I could work with children in a much more powerful way. Because I think I had always paid attention to their emotional, mental health and well-being. I'd had that really terrible trauma in my final year at university, which kind of helped me to remind myself of the importance of a holistic approach to education, but didn't really have the tools to kind of really make children school-proof in the way that metacognition can. So yeah, that was very significant for me.
Yeah, likewise. My master's was really, really pivotal. And I'm not really sure why, but in a sense, it is it's like the mother of all metacognitive processes, isn't it? Where you just like you stick a stake in the ground and you circle around it and you look at it from lots of different angles, and it's like just a point of reflection that can be so liberating. Even when, like I've spoken about this before, but my master's, like, it didn't work. I did this dissertation about a thing that didn't work, and it felt horrible at the time. But I later came to realize that was absolutely transformational in my own thinking about why something didn't work. That's why it's so stupid when people say, "Oh, action research, there's no evidence that it raises attainment." It's like it's not how it works. It's like it's more of a slow burn thing than that. And I know that's also, you mentioned earlier that you really sort of sparked off Lawrence Stenhouse.
Yeah, so I mean, he says it's teachers in the end who will change the world of the classroom, and I really, really believe that. And he says they will do it by understanding it.
Yes.
Okay, so, and how do they understand it? They learn to ask questions, to reflect, to essentially to research, to be action researchers. And I think that doing my master's, I was doing a lot of action research, and it just, because it transformed who I was in the classroom, I thought, as a deputy, I started to kind of help teachers to really reflect on their practice in a way that was non-judgmental, but very much my feedback was, I understood the importance of that feedback being dialogic, and also the importance of being vulnerable myself with teachers, so working alongside them and not coming in and looking at them and making that judgment. So having said that, I want to be really clear that all power, it was Tony Benn who said to what obviously he repeated somebody else, but he said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I would say there was, headship, because there was so much to do here. There were probably times when I probably was a bit more dictatorial than I would have liked, because some of the kind of practices were so resistant, or some of the people enacting the practices were so resistant to change that sometimes you just have to have those really difficult and horrible, difficult conversations about whether or not we're a good fit. And it's not something that I would do now, because I think now I'm much more understanding that change takes time, and the proof of your leadership is how well you can communicate what it is that needs to happen within the school and the purpose of what you're doing. So when you can communicate the purpose, and when people kind of take that purpose on, then they develop a kind of resilience and a kind of determination to improve their own practice in a way that they don't if they don't see the purpose of why they're working in a school. So, I think very differently about leadership now, but I definitely did at times in the leadership here in the early days probably default back to probably not the best way of developing teachers as as kind of their ongoing development. So I'm very much committed to teachers as practitioner researchers, because I think when they start asking those questions about their practice, it's something that they will then kind of start to integrate almost metacognitively, like, why is that child not understanding this? What else could I do to help them approach this? Why is that child not engaging? What might I do to change the conditions in the classroom that might kind of facilitate their engagement? So it becomes it's a way of really developing inclusive practice in my mind, and which is very different from being evidence informed. So I do believe in using evidence, but I think we need to look at evidence with more criticality, because we need to ask ourselves, how was that evidence kind of, where are the claims come from? How was the evidence put together? What was the methodology? And I think for me, it's if you're really looking at how to develop reflexive and reflective teachers, it's much more about developing teacher practitioner researchers as opposed to just being evidence informed. I think that can actually kind of, again, unwittingly, and I know this is unwitting, as the Macpherson said, it was unwitting racism that caused the murder of Stephen Lawrence not being investigated properly. So this unwittingly, it actually makes teachers technicians again.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I want to promote.
Yeah, and this is something that's very live at the moment, isn't it? There was that recent piece that Gavin Williamson said something at a recent speech to teachers or a union or something, where he was like, essentially, like, the science is in now. We know the best way to teach is to sit them in rows and to just tell them stuff and to do lots of testing and retrieval. And there is a real, strong push towards seeing teaching in this very, very simple way, and it's really diminishing of us as teachers. And like you say, it's not educating the whole child, it's educating a very, very narrow aspect of what a child is. And I completely agree with you. And, as you know, we've got a shared passion for practitioner inquiry, and we've been working on this, the MARG group, the Metacognition Action Research Group with Shirley Larkin from Exeter University, which was unfortunately interrupted by COVID, but we'll be picking that up again later this year, hopefully.
Yeah.
But I'm totally with you. And Stenhouse is, for people who aren't aware, Stenhouse was just an education researcher, but very influential and very much an advocate of teachers being involved in research rather than it being something that's just the domain of academics. And he defined it as systematic inquiry made public, right? So there's this sharing element of this. This is not something that just happens within your own classroom, and that's partly why I made this Praxis website, and I'm working at the moment with people at Cambridge to make an even better version of that, so that we can join up all of this professional knowledge and get teacher inquiry. So go on.
I did respond to your questionnaire, and I suggested it was praxis for paradigm shift. So if we're about shifting paradigms, we need praxis, because it is something, my understanding of praxis is about, wanting to make a difference. It's about change. It's about, it's a kind of social justice idea for us here. It's not just about, reflecting on practice for, just for the knowledge side, but it's actually kind of leveling out. It's about making things fairer. And so for us, that's how we see practice. It's about driving our social justice agenda.
Yes, and that can only really make sense. Like I see the Lawrence Stenhouse, practitioner inquiry stuff. It's like the other end of the telescope. Like at one end, you've got the Education Endowment Foundation, who are doing all these huge, very expensive, scientific quasi experimental studies, like randomized controlled trials, and it's all like 50 schools in the control group, and we'll do robust, we'll throw money at this, and we'll crunch the numbers, and we'll figure out what works after all. And there's a whole range of questions that I have about that, which is probably a topic for another podcast. But even if randomized controlled trials could tell you what works, which they don't, but even if they could, that doesn't tell you anything about how to implement those ideas in your context. And I know that the EEF has got some implementation guidance, but it's lots of mentions of fidelity in it, and it's about sort of, again, it's like teacher as technician. We just have to be like to exercise fidelity in implementing these ideas from on high. And actually it totally overlooks like what the messy end of the other end of the telescope, which is like the individual practitioner who's figuring out what to do with this particular kid in this particular lesson, in this particular point in time, in this particular school, and it's all context driven, and none of that stuff is taken account of through these top-down models. And you have to have agency and autonomy of individuals at the thick end, at the business end of this. And so like close to practice research is so important. And it's something that I've been banging the drum of for a long time. But people don't seem to sort of to see the value in it to the extent that some of us do. So we'll be fighting that fight for some time to come, I think.
I think so, but and sadly they don't see how teachers engaging in practice inquiry become so enthused and enthusiastic about what is the best job in the world, as far as I'm concerned. And I think when you reduce teachers to technicians, it really dehumanizes them, and they don't exist in their entirety within that classroom because they are enacting an intervention, and they have to follow a plan. And teaching is so complex. It is about knowledge. It's in part about knowledge, but it's about so many other things. And it's being a teacher is such a complex art, because even if it's imparting knowledge, if that's what you are setting out to do, it's about creating the kind of learning conditions where every child can interact and engage in that learning with the kind of mental feelings of safety that teacher creates those conditions, and a teacher who isn't metacognitive, isn't self-aware, can't check in on that. So you're just going to reproduce the same inequalities. It's really not going to change, because it takes something far more radical than one intervention to actually reduce inequality. And that has to be our number one aim.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's doable. I did a talk recently about it's called How to Close the Disadvantage Gap, and like we know how to do this. That's something that I find really frustrating. Lots of the narratives that come out of the EEF, the sole purpose of the EEF, their mission statement is to close the disadvantage gap. But they often put out announcements saying the gap is going to get wider in the next 5 years, and there's nothing essentially that we can do about it, is almost what they're saying. And actually, there are lots of schools that have closed this gap completely. I don't know what the data is like currently at Rathfern, but I know that you've made huge headway in this area in recent years, and we know what works. And so this is not a sort of throwing your hands up in the air and, oh no, isn't the gap the difficult thing to fix? It's the mother of all implementation problems, but it's doable. Implementation science is a thing now. We can fix this.
It's the thing that's so contradictory about it is I think that it comes from a deficit view of schools and leadership. I think the deficit is that the view is that I think their view is that people like me and Kulvan and others who are doing it, we're the exception, that not all people can be like us. Therefore, they need to give everybody else this universal kind of one-size-fits-all approach. But in doing that, they're never going to get more people who take risks and who develop their own kind of purpose in education, because they're so used to being told what that is. They're so used to following policy blindly without asking questions. So I think it's another example of just probably a kind of having a good intention, but the actual kind of consequence of it is just disastrous, because, there are some people that I speak to who still don't know what the EEF is, who still hear the word metacognition and think this is a really complex polysyllabic word that maybe we shouldn't be using in primary school.
Yeah.
It's like, metacognition? What's that? That sounds complex. And I said, well, you're actually doing some of it now because you're asking me a question. I don't know. I don't have the answers. The only thing I can say is that the way that we're trying to work with being constantly refining our approach and being really clear why we are doing what we are doing, and it's to reduce inequality, it's to make sure that our children leave as informed, compassionate citizens of the world who want to have a planet, who want the SDGs. That kind of drives us. And I think the only good thing about this new framework, if there is one, the Ofsted one, is that, they talk about quality education as opposed to just outcomes. So, when you actually start asking what is quality education, that is a question, that lots of us have different answers for, but that's an opportunity for us to, define it in our way as school leaders. For us, a quality education is having citizens of a democracy who will be critical and have the knowledge to truly question the policies that are being enacted by government, which is how you will stop the kind of historical atrocities of the Holocaust and all these other things that have happened, and far more recent ones like George Floyd happening, because people will be asking these really important questions. So, there are some positives in this crazy neoliberal landscape, because when Ofsted talks about quality of education, it requires us to have an intent. So what is our intention? Why are we doing what we are doing? Well, we can interpret that in our own way, because I certainly know why we're doing what we're doing here.
Yes. Yeah. I love that quote. So last week I wrote something that you said that's sort of similar to what you were saying. You said, it was definitely a sound-biteable sentence. You said, in this neoliberal Orwellian reality, we're still able to sow the seeds of liberation, which is a lovely summary, I think, of what we're all about. I think it's fair to say that we have slipped seamlessly into the rethinking education part of this conversation. So let's sort of just formalise that a little bit. I essentially ask 6 questions in this podcast. And so we're up to question 4. And it's essentially positives, challenges and fixes. So let's take the positives first. What is there in the education system? It could be in your school. It could be more widely within the area. It could be in some school in Timbuktu that you've heard of. What is there that you see happening in education that you think is really good, that you would like to see more of?
Well, actually, I am pleased that now we're talking about quality of education, and that Ofsted has has acknowledged that this focus only on performance has really skewed the curriculum, has skewed school improvement approaches, to becoming, bizarrely, their measurement of schools has caused, has reduced schools to act in this way. So schools really need to ask, we kind of need to use this opportunity where they're rethinking the way they've been judging schools, to help us, give us the courage to rethink what we're doing. So I think that's a really positive part of what's happening. And then I think we need to maintain that criticality when we think about knowledge, and that makes me think about their view of knowledge and cultural and social capital. So I think although it was the tragic death of George Floyd, but it has sparked a lot of really important conversations about race equality and has got people thinking more about decolonising. And I think that's a really important movement that's taking place and gaining momentum, because, this is a long time, has been something that's been needing to happen for a long time. Earlier, I talked about my experience of school and feeling very othered all the time. And I think something we've worked really tirelessly on is promoting that kind of curriculum and pedagogy of belonging here. And part of that is decolonising the curriculum. So making sure that, the migration story of this nation is something that we understand not just through the Romans and the Vikings, but more recent waves of immigration, which have resulted in me being here, for example, I'm second generation. So it's really important. It would have made such a difference to my kind of sense of safety and belonging if somebody had reminded me at school that World War II and World War I was also fought by Indian soldiers, of which I have Indian heritage. And it's these elements of our curriculum that I think will not only help people like me and children, the people like me, my children, to feel that they belong, but also help white British children to understand why their nation is multicultural and to understand the rights of those of us that are here to be here. Even, I think anybody, I believe in freedom of movement, okay? I believe in the UN's, CRC, we're a rights respecting school. So every child, wherever they are, has a right to an education, whether or not they've got a British passport or not. But nevertheless, understanding why Britain is what it is an important movement happening that is, I hope, will get some, with the Welsh government have taken this up. So they've integrated that. So why not the British English government? So I'm really hopeful that will happen.
Can you explain a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing around decolonising the curriculum and what that has looked like in terms of curriculum planning at Rathfern?
So we've been decolonising for quite some time. So that's very much not only kind of understand the migration story, but also, for us, it's about reframing. Education is giving children the opportunity. It's not indoctrinating, but giving them the opportunity to look at things differently. So if you only present them with a Eurocentric view of the world, which doesn't include, say, the Islamic golden age of Islam, you don't help them reframe their view of, the current view of Islam is, most Muslims are terrorists. They want to bomb the world. How can you help people have a different perspective on this? Well, one way we do it is that we celebrate sort of just what the Islamic civilization gave and how the Islamic civilization, the golden age of Islam, actually preceded the Renaissance and the kind of growth of ideas and science in Europe. So that's one way of doing it. So we compare Baghdad with Europe at the same time. We also, when we look at Benin, we start off with Benin. So we very much are reframing children's views of Africa as kind of this kind of part of the world, time in history where Benin was this amazing civilization, so well organized, so well ordered. Nothing like it was known in Europe. But then we move on to kind of the Tudors, and we start to re-look at those voyages of discovery as actually times of kind of the beginning of colonialization and imperialism, because actually there was a desire to look at the world of Benin and to take control of its riches in a way that was the roots of capitalism and gave this nation and Europe the money and the wealth to drive the Industrial Revolution. So, we're really looking at things in quite a very different way. But we also, very important to us is is kind of resistance. So I mentioned earlier that part of the reason that I was able to kind of become a teacher or get a decent education was because I resisted what people were telling me about myself. So resistance is a really important part of coming alive as a human being. And so sometimes people see children being angry as, terrible. But I often talk to children about this as resistance. You're resisting something. What you're resisting? Resistance can be amazing. It can change the world, But, think about it in this way. So we look at resistance to racism in this nation. So we don't look at just focus on the civil rights movement in America, which is important, but we look at the Bristol bus boycott, the Battle of Lewisham, obviously. We look at Doreen Lawrence as a significant individual. We look at the Notting Hill Carnival that came out of the race riots after the murder of Kelso Cole-Crane. So, we're feeding into our curriculum and our children's experience that in this country people stood up against racism, not just after Black Lives Matters, but way back in history of this country.
Thank you very much. I mean, I absolutely agree with you. This is urgent and necessary work that's taking place, and it's great that it's happening. And it's obviously, quite controversial. This is quite a heated topic, and the whole sort of like, should we be teaching this canon of dead white males and all that stuff, and linking back to what you were talking about earlier about the importance, the significance of you finding yourself being in the visible majority, and what a transformational, you were talking about it almost as like this sort of transcendent moment of release or realization or something. And it's hard if you like, I am a white male and I'm in a white majority country, and it's hard to understand what the significance of being in a minority is psychologically. And so of course there's an aspect of this which is about representation and being able to see yourself in what you're learning about, but it's not just about that. Like, it's just it's just a more well-rounded, truthful, education, right? I would have loved to have learned about the golden age of Islam or Benin and all these things that you're talking about what was happening in Baghdad pre-Renaissance. This is just fascinating stuff. Like, it's so important that this work takes place. And I know you've been doing some work. So you spoke to the Chartered College a while ago about this, didn't you?
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it all comes back to justice. So whether that's class justice, race justice, gender justice, it really is important. It just feels to me as if, we have to have a tragic murder, another tragic murder, for us to kind of be forced to kind of into this uncomfortable space, because it is uncomfortable. It's also, for me, it is about diversity, but it's way more than that. It's about inequity, because people of colour can enact injustice, and we see that all over the world. So, and I enact whiteness because I emulated whiteness. I remember at school hating my name and wanting to be called Janet, and I just hated feeling so different to everybody else. So, these default behaviors are things that being metacognitive helps me to monitor and manage in myself as well. So Frantz Fanon, who talks about, the white mask, blackface white mask sort of concept of the post-colonial construct, I so much see myself in it. And with my older son, I remember when he was younger, he would often call me out when I was enacting whiteness. He would say that I would talk a different way when I was with different people. He would kind of stereotype me in quite a humorous way that helped me to kind of see myself doing things that, I probably wouldn't have realized if he hadn't disrupted that. I think we have to do a lot of disruption in education and interruption all the time.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean,
there is a place for knowledge, so, I like the way Michael Young talks about, we need to question where this knowledge comes from. Just because it is, it doesn't mean it's truthful knowledge, but, decolonising the curriculum helps you look at the knowledge even of the canon in a different way. So there's a place for, knowing certain information, but not at the expense of the wider picture of where that information came from or how it sits alongside other knowledge. because otherwise you will never reduce inequality. You will never rid schools of that kind of white privilege that will be at the root of race inequality and that default behaviour within the pedagogical practices that might be great pedagogical practices but are being enacted with this biased behaviour. So
yes. I wonder about the language of it. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. Like, there's something about the phrase decolonising the curriculum that it seems to suggest that it was colonised, right, in the way that Commonwealth countries were colonised, and I'm not sure that it was in that sense. It's not like we had this sort of globally equally represented curriculum that was sort of colonised in that same way. And it seems like it just seems like it's more like broadening the curriculum. I don't know about. I just don't really understand what the actual word decolonising means in this context. And it seems to sort of to get people's backs up to an extent, and that might not be a bad thing, but it also maybe sort of strategically we end up with things like this race commission report that's just come out, which is sort of like a doubling down of saying like there's nothing to see here sort of thing, and there's no need to decolonize the curriculum. I just wonder about what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and it's one that I keep asking myself. Because when you say decolonizing, it feels really uncomfortable. If you say diversifying, it kind of placates people. And I don't really think I want to placate. And my view very much is the reason it's decolonizing is because it links to kind of my malleable intelligence and metacognition and moral purpose, because colonization was about dehumanization. And if we don't decolonize, we will continue to dehumanize, but with a diversified curriculum. So you may have more kind of. This is about the curriculum and the pedagogy. For me, it is a political act. It's about power and the power imbalance of colonization, and it's about recalibrating that power imbalance so that we recognize the root of that historical epoch as one of crude exploitation that was maybe enacted through the pedagogies rather than the curriculum earlier. So for me, it's not just the curriculum that needs to be colonized, it's also pedagogy. And I think it's not just decolonizing, it's everything else. So that's one element of it, because that really gets to the heart about addressing the race inequality. But we've still got class inequality and we've got gender. So it's one part and it's not binary. You don't do that and then not do something else. It's a multi-pronged approach, I think, to getting social justice happening. Because, there's other elements of social justice for me are around, challenging kind of the myth of meritocracy, about the marketization of education. They're, for me, all parts of the way we perpetuate inequality.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's a very persuasive answer. I'll think some more about that. And obviously, it's not up to me, is it? It doesn't matter what I think.
It's not up to me either.
Yeah. Of course.
And I may change my mind. I would hope that I would keep open to. But for me, it's my gut instinct with what colonization has done and how it's not gone. I mean, modern day globalization is a form of colonization. The modern day, okay, it's been disrupted with COVID, but the way, we've transported our call centers to India and we're using, really highly skilled graduates to answer phones, to rip people off in this country is another kind of machination of colonization in a way. And also colonization can be, it's this post-colonial construct. So, brown, black capitalists need to be decolonized. It's not always a race issue, though it is a race issue, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Okay, and so linked to this, I know that we spoke about unconscious bias earlier as it relates to, you know, like teachers and having certain attitudes around what young people can and can't achieve. But I know that we've spoken before about unconscious bias as it plays out just in the way that it's usually referred to in terms of race. I wonder if you can expand on your sort of maybe through your own personal experience, your experience of how unconscious bias plays out in schools, or maybe just thinking about the issue on a more general level.
I mean, this is where, for me, it's the complexity of teaching and learning. It comes into play. So, you know, people who come into the educational space with a really full sense of themselves. So they emotionally and mentally, psychologically are very secure because they come from that kind of home where they've been given those tools to operate. Probably have greater resilience to the bias. So, you know, being reflective of myself, I think I was a very vulnerable learner. Very much in tune with my community, not having those that kind of life experience that gives you that kind of those sharp elbows that you often see middle class children do. So you are really at the behest of people who can enact their power through, as you say, it's not so crude anymore. It's through setting of children. It's through the way teachers talk about and with parents from disadvantaged and minority ethnic communities. And it's, just generally how teachers will respond to children's not being able to understand, or how leaders may respond to teachers of colour or of a certain class. So all of that bias is being enacted out in school improvement, within the pedagogy. And we need to look at what that does. It basically says that somebody from a certain race or class cannot transform or grow or develop in the same way that a middle class person who isn't brown can. And that's hugely exhausting to navigate on a daily basis when you're a person of color and class, that you just have to live with this kind of, being constantly othered in a space which is meant to be inclusive. It's exhausting, I think, but it is something you get used to being on the battleground with and just dealing with. But it kind of adds to the anger that you feel, which is why it's really important to not dismiss anger, but to begin to understand where it's coming from and how the system perpetuates and escalates the anger through not tackling that bias.
Yes, yeah, I can see. And I've noticed a lot of people talking about that feeling of exhaustion, in particular in relation to this race commission report that's just come out, where people are just thinking, oh, I can't just keep fighting this. And people have been using this term gaslighting, which is sort of like the word of the year, but it seems to be pretty fairly used in this case, that it's just like saying there's not a problem here, and if you think it is, it's like sort of, victim blaming, essentially, that you're not sort of resilient enough if you think that you're being unconsciously treated differently or consciously.
Yeah, I think it shows a gross lack of kind of dealing with the evidence. Okay, so the evidence actually tells us that these children, if we want to go for evidence, just look at the outcomes for certain student groups. And okay, you might then say, there are some ethnic minority groups that do actually do very well in the system, and that's true. But actually, generally, when you put race and class together, they don't do very well. So yes, you can single out groups. So I remember when I became the head here, when I was challenging some things, I was accused of being racist against certain groups. And because assumptions were made about my background as an Asian woman, that I came from a privileged background, and therefore I didn't understand the lived experience when I was, and it's just, it's hugely frustrating that we have this report, but not at all surprising. We could have predicted it. Critical race theory would have predicted it, that, when things are getting really difficult, the system will react in this way. So I'm not surprised by it. And I think, if anything, it reminds me of just how hard this struggle is, and how much we need to keep on challenging and fighting and being committed to social justice, because this is going to happen over and over again. The system is not going to stand up and say, yes, I am this and I'm going to change. No, the system will protect itself through any means possible to preserve its privilege. Including using Black people.
Indeed, as happened in this case, it seems. There was a brilliant takedown of that report. Ash Sarkar did a video for Double Down News yesterday, which I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't.
I'll send you a link. I don't
know. Yes, please.
If you contribute to Double Down News, then you get stuff. I think it's on a private YouTube thing. Anyway, I'll send it you. And
my husband does, so we'll get it. I'll get it.
I'll put it in the show notes as well, because it's really worth watching. So we're in the positives here. So we're like this idea that Ofsted is recognising the quality of education goes beyond exams is a positive, and this whole movement of decolonising the curriculum. We talked about how problematic and challenging and exhausting it is, but the fact that it is happening and that it is gaining such traction and that it is so squarely in so many people's sites, you see this continually playing out online, and so it seems to be broadly a good thing, although it's difficult, challenging work, that this is taking much more of a central place, largely empowered by the BLM and people around that. So is there anything else that you have in the positives list?
I guess the fact that we are, we talk more about research now than we ever did when I first started teaching. So I think whilst we have this obsession with evidence, and the evidence we're looking for has to be on children's outcomes, I think maybe the change to Ofsted may have an impact on the EEF and its approach, because Ofsted's looking not just at outcomes. So that might have some impact on the way that the EF operates. And I think there are moves within the EF to, despite this huge amount of money spent on random control trials, I think there's the Great Teaching Toolkit, which I don't know you've looked at, which I think has got some really promising elements to it. So there's, that's something positive that teachers can look at to help and guide us into getting the kind of pedagogy as opposed to the kind of vision for schools. I think school leaders still need to be asking themselves why are we doing what we're doing? So that hasn't changed. I think. Yeah, I think that's probably it on the positives.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to challenges then. What do you see as being the main challenges that we face?
Okay, inequality, which, is and will, continue to be kind of, so systemic, and then made further propounded when we get the reports that you mentioned, which take us back but mustn't stop us. So I think, the rising inequality and what's happened with COVID and how we navigate kind of the growing inequality, that's a huge problem and challenge for educators that we are all grappling with, but making sure, there's some, I guess, coming back to, because you can't talk about problems without talking about solutions, because otherwise I wouldn't be a school leader. So, it's very much about looking at that inequality, but making sure we are still mindful of how we get children back into the space of learning by paying attention to their mental health and well-being. And I'm really pleased that many schools are focusing on that. So that's another positive. I think the kind of focus on mental health and well-being for children and staff is really positive movement, because that will stop us moving back to that reductive kind of treating children like, empty vessels and teachers like workhorses to get results. So that's a really positive. Another problem, so inequality, whether that's class, race, is a problem that I think will always be there. I think as long as, I alluded to this earlier, just as I do not believe we will get environmental justice in the current economic system, I just think it's fundamentally incompatible. I think inequality of outcome for class and race is unlikely to happen in our political kind of paradigm. So I think I'm hoping that we can shift that.
It's interesting how that language is reflected in the SDGs, isn't it? Because it says, like, one of them, for example, is no poverty and zero hunger and stuff. And then the inequalities one, it says reduced inequalities, right? So it seems like there's an acceptance that this is always going to be with us. And of course, you're never going to have a completely homogenous world. I don't even know what such a thing could look like. So maybe it's just a reflection of that reality, but it does, compared with some of the other language, it does seem like it's a little bit less ambitious than some of the others.
I think there's an acknowledgement of the kind of global economic systems that have a vested interest in perpetuating it. But this is why metacognition and purpose and malleable intelligence are so important. So our most disadvantaged children, who are most likely to come to school believing that they're not intelligent, with our approach, will be liberated by schools that demonize them because they're just not working hard enough. That's the whole kind of rationale of meritocracy. If you just work harder, you can make it. And for me, that's a really pernicious myth. And it really, really is one that schools and politicians should work harder at debunking. Because it's so corrosive, it's so toxic, it so dehumanizes the most vulnerable members of our society, and it's deeply unjust. So for me, that's a real problem. Meritocracy.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And linked to this, you sent me, I love how you send me little videos and stuff. The piece from Danny Dorling, the geography professor, who sort of talks about how inequality is so intertwined with environmental problems that we see, that actually disproportionately it's like the top 1% who cause the most damage to the environment. So then the more unequal society is, the more damaging it is to the environment.
But why don't we talk about this? Why are these ideas not mainstream? Because actually what we want to perpetuate is that we all want to be in that 1%. That shouldn't be the desirable outcome for humanity, because actually the desirable outcome for humanity should be living in tune with the planet. And the planet has got limits, so we actually owe it to children to say the answer isn't becoming rich, because rich people actually behave in this way. Yes, being materially comfortable is really important for everybody, and we can do it. So, yeah, absolutely. For me, again, coming back to the SDGs is sort of, helping children to understand that reducing inequalities is much more likely to help us to get environmental justice. So it's kind of, even if you can't care about humanity, you might care about the planet enough to want to consume less.
Yeah. Yes, and I'm happy, by the way, to take these, although I sort of talk about challenges and then fixes, it makes sense to talk about the solutions, because like you say, they're sort of intertwined around the problems. And so in terms of inequality, I mean, lots of the stuff that we've been talking about already today is all about this, right? The decolonisation stuff, and the moral purpose and metacognition and malleable intelligence, and changing people's beliefs and so on. In terms of just what it looks like in classroom practice, what would you say if you had to sort of to pinpoint let's say 2 or 3 sort of specific policies or practices that you have enacted or seen enacted within Rathfern that have been effective in closing those outcomes in terms of disadvantage and inequality?
Okay, so it's working with teachers, so very much in line with what Kulvan was talking about, so that commitment to working with teachers, because teachers enact the pedagogies in the classroom. So without teachers having that moral purpose to reduce those inequalities, they're not going to have that drive to resist those default practices.
Right.
So that's kind of key to our work. But then within the classroom, giving children that kind of language of learning, but also using success criteria in a metacognitive sense. So, being able to plan, monitor, and kind of control your learning is really that whole metacognitive cycle really works around understanding the importance of kind of creating success criteria with children and within classroom practice, but more in line with metacognition. Children and adults having that language of learning is really key, and having that commitment to malleable intelligence helps children to understand that when things are tricky, they have a number of internal resources that help them not shut down in that situation. So something we've talked, I think one of the first things I said as a head was, what I really hope we will all appreciate better at the end of this year is that learning is uncomfortable, and so that's pretty much the hallmark of our kind of, so entering that kind of zone of discomfort is something that we believe is a really desirable state for teachers and children, and it isn't something that we shy away from, and that's also morally. So, engaging with the SDGs is actually uncomfortable because it's far easier to peddle the myth that everyone can become a celebrity and everyone can just be and become whatever they want and then go on to be this, actually to interrupt that and say, well, what is success for me, for you, for our class, for our community, for our planet, is kind of interrupting things. So that's a really important part of how we set out to plan our curriculum, for opportunities to interrupt and then recalibrate and reframe the way that we're thinking to become these informed citizens. But pedagogically, it's about teachers having the moral purpose, which gives them the kind of focus in the classroom to not even unwittingly kind of ability group. So we do no ability grouping here. We don't use the word ability. We talk about confidence. So my teachers are regularly kind of quite shocked when they hear people in a very kind of matter of fact say high ability, low ability, medium ability. They say to me, what's that? It's so far from the world of their lived experience as a teacher that they really find it repugnant. So that's really feels very kind of, I feel really proud of that.
Yeah, so you should. And it is incredible how widespread that is when you hear teachers, so especially at primary, saying my middles and my lowers, and it's like it's really embedded in the way that the teachers are trained. And I'm starting to see now, so in terms of just the practicalities of that, you were talking about moral purpose earlier, and that almost sounds like it's quite an abstract idea. It's like, yes, we have a moral sense of purpose, but it's like, what is morality into, like, how does that look? But I can see now that you could like making the moral purpose explicit, and especially like at the hiring stage, that you're making clear that this is something that is driven by the teacher. So this is not some sort of top-down diktat or policy that they need to show fidelity to out of being a good technician or professional. It's about harnessing the power of human agency and also anger, like you were talking about earlier. Like using that anger as an energy.
And for me that's so important, James, because when I see teachers that come here, I really want them to fall in love with the craft and pedagogy and purpose of teaching so that they become leaders one day, if that's what they choose, with that clarity of purpose and not because they want to climb some career ladder. For me, I don't know how I became a head teacher. It was definitely not on the cards for me at all. I did not come in with that sense of I will be ever, not in a million years. If anyone had said to me, what do you want to be? It was never anything like this. So, I am pretty much a reluctant leader in that sense. And that's important because it keeps, because I so love what happens in the classroom, and I so love how text can transform and the curriculum can develop that kind of love, that belonging, that kind of desire to enact the goals in a scientific way or a kind of humanitarian way, that I don't want to lose that class, that focus from the classroom. I don't want to be divorced from that. And very much resonated with what Kulvan said about being still in the classroom, being very much working alongside teachers to plan kind of the curriculum that does that interrupting of thinking and being as a human being. And a lot of my teachers, when they join us, they have that kind of passion actually for social justice, but not necessarily environmental justice, and they grow with that. So, we talk a lot about some of the things we do here around, the community garden and other projects we've got is around helping everybody understand that, to slow down, and things don't happen overnight, and growing plants takes time, and that's not a bad thing, because the zeitgeist is quick fix, quick turnaround, quick this, get what I want now. And we're trying to interrupt all of that in quite a skillful way by doing things differently.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry.
That's all right. And
it's not a COVID cough.
And you seem to be achieving some notable success in this area, which is great. And I know that you're now very engaged with the wider community of schools in Lewisham.
Yeah, we're running a 30-school project called Your Voice Can Change the World. And that is linked with 30 schools in Mpumalanga in South Africa. So I mentioned earlier that actually a significant moment for me also in my life, I'm not sure I directly mentioned it, was learning about apartheid, because when I learned about apartheid, that was a kind of really grotesque, explicit, kind of magnified version of my daily experience. And again, that helped me reframe my injustice into this wider global struggle. And so apartheid has always been and the kind of post-apartheid, the journey to dismantle apartheid, which I was very involved in small way. I was a non-stop picketer. It's how I met my husband. We were both non-stop picketers, sort of protesting. So being part of a movement that, then saw a real kind of political change. So South Africa's been really always close to my heart. And when I've always been against these deficit kind of global exchanges, because I've always thought it's this charity idea that we're going to tell you in a poor country how to do things, and I just don't want to do this. Feels like another version of colonialism. So like a year ago when I did it, created a project called The World Has Enough for Everyone's Need, Not Greed. That was that project. And that was with 3 schools in Lewisham and 3 schools in Mpumalanga. And that's how those schools adopted the SDGs. So all of the schools now in Mpumalanga have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals through the work that happened a year ago, 2 years ago, and now 30 schools have officially adopted them. So yeah, we're driving the SDGs through Lewisham schools now.
Amazing. That's great to hear. So I know that your twins are outside, and we should
Yes.
let you enjoy some of your Easter holiday. Is there anything else in the challenges and solutions column that you sort of had in mind that you wanted to talk about?
I started off this conversation with, I'm really not sure why I'm here. But, if anything, I would say to keep asking ourselves why we are doing what we are doing, so that we don't, we steer away from being leaders. You wouldn't do that, James, because you're just, you're a square. The whole way that you've kind of brought people together is like nothing short of revolutionary in itself. But you're so I don't know what more I can add, because people are all sentient. But I want the really important part of the way I approach things is that we do want to be evidence informed, but we also should know that evidence can be contested and should be contested, and that criticality is a really important part of. Freire said reading is not just learning to read is not reading the word, it's reading the world.
Yeah.
And a really important part of our approach is reading the world around injustice, but reading the world of research as well. And so saying, this, it needs to be contested, and being critical even of the findings of the EEF and others, and really working and being brave as a leader to encourage teachers to ask questions and become researchers within their classroom, but never lose sight of their purpose, I guess. And the whole journey Rathfern has been on and continues to be on with our kind of, our strap line actually is where everyone learns to learn. That's what we believe in, because we believe learning is so much more than passing exams. It's about asking these questions of the world, of ourselves, who we are and how we are. And metacognition, in my view, is the closest we're going to get developing children's language of learning, their ability to be able to plan, monitor, and regulate themselves as learners. The closest we're going to get to that.
Yes. It's so lovely to hear you sort of using that language of learning to learn, because it feels to me that that's very much what you're about. And obviously, that's been the focus of my work in recent years. And just to close, we talked earlier about you sort of being quite a fearless person, partly because of the life experiences that you've had. And it seems like that, so at the end of our book, Fear is the Mind Killer, we identified 6 antidotes to fear. And they are safety, confidence, experience, knowledge, closing the gap, and courageous leadership. And it just seems that Rathfern embodies all 6 of those, and it really feels like your young people are going to be, just like taking the world by the scruff of the neck. And that lovely thing that you sent me recently, the opera that you were involved in, it was such a powerful thing. I don't know if is that available that we could link to as well in the show notes so that people can see. Would you mind to just explain a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, so I really wanted the children. So, a little secret of mine is that I love opera. And actually, my family used to call me the singing nun, which is bizarre because we're Muslims. But we didn't have, access to much music. So I used to bring home the hymn books because it was a Christian school. And so I was always singing them like a mad opera singer. I think it was a way of dealing with it. So, I've always had this. And then as I got older, I learned about opera. And so I thought, but I want to do this in a really creative way. And it would be really great. The children have been in lockdown. Let's kind of look at a kind of different way of looking at opera to make sense of the lockdown experience for our year 6 children. So I was speaking to this guy who writes opera, and he actually trained the children, had this amazing experience where they were working online with this opera singer. I think she was in Holland, and they were having live direct lessons, but they created their opera. So they wrote it, they put it together, and it's a very unconventional opera, but it actually incorporates the feeling of transition, leaving the school, but also of Black Lives Matters and of many other thoughts. So it's fairly chaotic, actually, but powerful, I would say, opera. So, and the children wrote it. So what more do we want?
Yeah, it's very moving. It's an absolutely beautiful piece of work and really, really well shot, because it's not easy to shoot things when the kids are in school. There's like classrooms in the background and they're wearing uniforms, and it's hard to make something look really, really visually arresting, but it was visually arresting, and there's spoken word in there. They say spoken using the students' own words. So that's a wonderful piece of work. So yes, well, I know that you said at the start of this conversation that you were like, I'm not sure if I've got anything that people will be interested to hear, but I don't think that there's any doubt that that people will be interested to listen to this conversation. I think that you are you'll probably find this really awkward to listen to, but I just think that you're a very inspirational person. You're like an incredible example of what courageous moral leadership looks like, and I know that I'm not alone in thinking that, but I'm not going to embarrass you with any further flattery, other than to just say thank you very much indeed for sharing your morning or afternoon now with me. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day and your Easter holidays and get some well-earned rest. My goodness, what a few years it's been.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. And, I said earlier that I think the whole Rethinking Education podcast is so fantastic. And, I've told so many people to listen, because although the podcasts are very, they're quite long, and you really get a sense of who people are through listening, and much more than what they do, but kind of why they do the things they do and how they've come to what they're doing and how they're going to go on to do things. So I just want to thank you for putting together this coalition of very different people, but also really people who are rethinking things in really powerful ways. And I think what you're doing is really powerful. So thank you very much, James. Time is a measure of change. We don't have much time. Time is a measure of change.